another orientation to existence that connects our relation to the ultimate source of value and reality to our relation to one another. And it is an orientation to life, an approach to the conduct of life that we might call the overcoming of the will and of the world. As we have done on other occasions, we're going to conduct this class initially by a conversation between the two of us, which will then open up to all of you. And we intend to move in the following steps. So the first step is briefly to evoke the problem of nihilism. The second is to address the essence of Schopenhauer's philosophy and to speak to its metaphysical background. The third is to discuss the moral agenda that emerges from this project. The fourth is then to criticize this moral agenda. And the fifth is to end with the problem of hope, or the opportunity of hope, and that's in a way to circle back to the point of departure of nihilism. So one way to think about nihilism is that nihilism is the view that our existence and the world itself are meaningless. We might nevertheless think that in a meaningless world, we can make meaning. In Samuel Beckett's play, Endgame, the main character, Ham, says, "You're on Earth. There's no cure for that." And that is in a way of beginning an introduction to the problem of nihilism. Schopenhauer has various pictures of our fundamental situation in the world and is prodigal in metaphors. One of them I referred to in an earlier class. We're like porcupines in the dark. They come closer together to warm one another against the cold night, and then they stick one another, and then they move further apart, and then they become cold, and they go back and forth restlessly between proximity and distance until they settle into an uncomfortable middle distance. Another metaphor that Schopenhauer uses is that we're like people shipwrecked, cast on a little boat in the ocean amid the storm, and clinging to one another on this little boat. Now, David Hume has a similar characterization with a different tone, but suggesting the same kind of relation between meaningless and solidarity. And I'm going to read to you a famous passage from Hume's treatise on human nature. Most fortunately, it happens that nature herself cures of this philosophical melancholy and delirium. I play a game of backgammon, I converse and am merry with my friends, and when after 3 or 4 hours' amusement I would return to these speculations, they appear so cold and strange and ridiculous that I cannot find in my heart to enter into them any farther. In another place, Hume remarked that the mistakes of religion are dangerous, whereas the mistakes of philosophy are merely ridiculous. And there's the same fundamental idea here, that the solution to nihilism, we are the solution for one another, to the extent that there is any solution. And this then is the ground on which we will engage Schopenhauer's philosophy. It raises already the question to which we'll come back at the end, which is the question of hope. How much can we hope for? Can we infer the general lines of a response to the conduct of life from an understanding of the world and of ultimate reality and value? Or is it futile to make such an attempt? Now, in a sense, Schopenhauer does try to infer a response to the problem of existence from a view of reality. And he does insist that our relation to one another should be shaped by an understanding of our situation in the world. And so it seems that his relation to nihilism is ambivalent or complicated. He is nihilistic in some senses, but he is anti-nihilistic in others. And we will explore that ambivalence in the course of this conversation.
No, I think that ambivalence is a very, very propitious way to start. First, let's just say this about Arthur Schopenhauer, that he is certainly one of the, if not the most profound and provocative philosophers in the history of the modern world. That his influence among artists is more broad than any other philosopher in the modern world. That's why Tolstoy had a picture of Schopenhauer on his wall. Einstein did too, but Einstein's a different kind of artist. Maupassant and Zola wrote a whole novel, The Joy of Life, reflecting on Schopenhauer. Samuel Beckett's great text of 31 on Proust is very much about Schopenhauer and Pascal. Thomas Hardy, the greatest poet novelist in the English language, who wrote both poetry and novels, obsessed with Schopenhauer. Turgenev, we can go on and on and on. What was it about this philosophic wrestling with nihilism that would have such impact on towering artists, given his obsession with art and especially music, and given his obsession with what he calls the divine Plato and the great Kant? These two pillars, as it were, that allows him to come to terms with a response to nihilism, given his particular conception of it, and his attempt to either work through it or escape. We'll have to see whether he's actually still escaping, as it were, or whether he thinks, in fact, there's no way of really working through nihilism. You're going to have some form of illusion in order to live, in order to endure. Now, the one thing to keep in mind, I'm so glad you mentioned David Hume here, because the author Schopenhauer, you notice his word author, is the father named him author because the name is spelled the same in German, in French, and in English. And his father was a cosmopolitan businessman who made sure that Arthur Schopenhauer spent time in France 2 years, spoke fluent French, read French newspapers every day, and spent time in England. He read the London Times every day. He's the only great German philosopher who actually read English. Very important. Kant read Bowdlerized translations of David Hume. Nietzsche, in all of his greatness, still carried Emerson's translation of Emerson in his back pocket, Bowdlerized too. So he had an erudition that was broad. The connection with the East, we already noted, you see. But he also had a cosmopolitan quality to his engagement with the problem of nihilism, of meaninglessness, and so forth. And he actually planned to write a translation of David Hume's Treatise of Human Nature. He wrote an introduction that was lost. Very rare. And he wanted to translate Kant, his quasi-demi-philosophic God, into English. Very rare. And this is someone who completely evades the academy. Completely. And we all know the story of him having the gumption to schedule his lectures exactly the same hour as Hegel. And nobody shows up. And 5 folks showed up and stayed about 5 minutes and left. And Hegel's got hundreds, you see. So that he's got a certain animus against the professors of philosophy. And I'm sure you had a chance to read that if you read those 3 prefaces, or at least those first 2 prefaces of his work. But like David Hume, Schopenhauer is a philosopher who generates a synoptic, synthetic, and synecdochic view of the world as a young man. He writes what you read in his 20s. The text comes out when he's 29. And that had never been done with the exception of David Hume, who wrote a Treatise of Human Nature when he was 26. And Schopenhauer never writes another text. The rest of his life is an elaboration, emendation, revision, and interpretation of that young man's book. And so this sense of wrestling with nihilism in his own life, so that on the page, and he was generally agreed to be the greatest German prose writer of modern times, not just as a philosopher, you see. So he's got an artistic temperament, very rare among philosophers. And for him, philosophy must go to school with the arts, especially the musicians. You see. So the texts are like 4 movements in a symphony, as it were. You see. And the question will be, can he discern certain truths in nihilism that enables him to either work through nihilism or to escape and evade nihilism? I mean, this is going to be one of the challenges that we have.
So in this regard, it may be useful to explore for a moment a difference between Hume and Schopenhauer, which helps us understand in what respect Schopenhauer was anti-nihilistic. So Hume refers at the beginning of that passage that I just read to you to philosophical melancholy and delirium. So what is the melancholy? The melancholy is the view that our practices, the practices that shape social life, our relations to one another, have no ground, that they're arbitrary. That's the melancholy. And what then is the delirium? The delirium, encouraged by the melancholy, is the attempt to transcend the world of social practices and habits, the idea of philosophy as a super science that reveals the ultimate foundations. That's delirious, according to Hume. And we have to overcome both the melancholy and the delirium in order to return to the world of social practice, to our habits, to our conventions, and through them to one another. Now, a fundamental difference between that view and Schopenhauer's is this. For Schopenhauer, in fact, this world of conventions and habits and practices is false and is our enemy. And we can achieve the right relation to one another only by defying those illusions. And so our ability to achieve consolation from one another depends not on re-entry into the world of convention and practice, but on overcoming it. And if we hope to overcome it, It must be because we can achieve contact with the real source of value and of truth, lying beyond the appearances. And in that sense, Schopenhauer is anti-nihilistic. So both Hume and Schopenhauer offer solidarity as a response to nihilism, but on a fundamentally different basis. One denouncing the attempt to achieve an understanding of ultimate reality, and the other embracing it. And now we're going to explore the content of this idea. So, what then is the essence of Schopenhauer's view? The world is not what it seems to be. Its distinctions and transmutations are illusory. If we allow ourselves to be taken in by these illusions, we become more susceptible to our cravings, to our desires. We are caught in the coils of the will. And caught in the coils of the will, we are unable to achieve serenity, to take possession of ourselves, and to be reconciled with one another. So at the core of this view is the idea that we have to understand what the world really is, and we can understand it. Schopenhauer says at the beginning of his book, "My philosophy is the definitive solution to the enigma of existence." Paradoxically, he says somewhere else that a man's philosophy is the expression of his temperament. So we have to understand what the ultimate source of truth and value is, to then develop a series of practices, of moral practices and insights that will liberate us from the will. We will be able to defeat the will, and defeating the will, achieve serenity and benevolence. This view then has a metaphysical background. But it is suggested by certain phenomena, by certain impulses that are pervasive in human experience and in history. So before considering its metaphysical background, let's take a look at these impulses which have perennially rekindled this option in the history of philosophical ideas in the world. So first there is the spectacle of suffering in the world. Suffering is pervasive. Schopenhauer remarks at the beginning of The World as Will and Representation that at any given time, countless numbers of beings, of animals, are tearing one another apart, alive, in order to live a little longer. Second, there is the experience that everything in the world is mutable, is ephemeral. Everything is turning into everything else. And third, there is the experience of mind, our mental experience, our experience of consciousness, which seems in some sense to be detached from the sufferings and ephemeral nature of our bodies, and to suggest to us the idea that mind or consciousness is just one thing. We appear to be distinct, but our mental experience, allowing us access to the consciousness of others, is ultimately unified. What then is the metaphysical background, the view that allows Schopenhauer and others to shape these experiences into a coherent conception. The view is one that we sometimes call, in the history of philosophy, speculative monism. And it has two main forms in the world history of thought. One form is radical, and the other form is qualified. The radical form is the claim that all the temporal changes in the world and all the distinctions are epiphenomenal and indeed illusory. Ultimate reality is unified and timeless. That's the radical form of the speculative monism. And we find it very early in the history of Western philosophy, in a thinker, in a pre-Socratic philosopher like Parmenides, and in the history of modern Western philosophy, in Spinoza, in some sense in Leibniz, but in the most radical, intransigent form in Schopenhauer. We also find it, remarkably, in the mystical countercurrents within the Semitic monotheisms. In Christian mysticism, for example, the mysticism cultivated by the Franciscan order, in Sufism within Islam, in the Kabbalah in Judaism, and these mystical countercurrents in the religions of the Bible have always been attracted to some form of the speculative monism. And their conception of God is the definition of God by negation. God is non-being and non-person, the via negativa. And it appears, it seems, that this mystical idea, flirting with the speculative monism, always borders on heresy. And indeed, it has been treated as heretical by the custodians of orthodoxy in those religions. But the speculative monism has also appeared in qualified form. The qualified form is the idea that the changes that take place in the world, that appear in the world, or the distinctions, are not completely unreal. They are simply less real than underlying realities. And an example would be Plato, Plato's middle philosophy, his doctrine, his theory of the forms. The archetypes of these shallow realities, these apparent changes. Now, what can we say about the speculative monism, and how can we engage with its truth claims? It seems that there are, at the beginning, two main problems, two objections that we could make to this view. At least to this view in its radical form. The first objection is that it seems to deprive us of any way of making sense of the world and of changes and distinctions in the world. How do we understand something? We understand something by having a view of how it can change, of what it can become. If we don't know how it can change, we don't understand it. We don't see it. We just stare at it. So this view observes transformation in the world. It sees that everything is ephemeral. But it provides us no key with which to understand the actual detailed content of transformation. To understand how some things turn into other things, we have to take them as real. We have to study the mechanism of transformation. And that seems to be incompatible with the speculative monism in its radical form. There would be an alternative view That's what I called in an earlier class the third undeveloped position in the world history of philosophy. The speculative monism associates reality with timelessness, as the Greek philosophy of being also did. In this third view, we would say everything that exists is temporary. Everything changes sooner or later, including change itself. But is no less real for being temporary. We then dissociate reality from timelessness. We reject the idea that there's a timeless typology of being, an ultimate structure of the world that has no history. And we say that even the regularities of the world are themselves have a history and are mutable. And that other view would then allow us to engage with the distinctions and the transformations, which the speculative monism seems to forbid us from doing. There's a second objection to the speculative monism as a representation of reality. And it is that it seems to offer no account of why the world appears in a form that denies its reality. So we experience distinctions, we experience transformations, and the radical monism says they're unreal. But why does the world appear in a form that is the denial of its reality? It seems that the speculative monism has no answer to that question and can have no answer. Now, these two classes of objection are momentous because what is at stake here is how we should direct our lives. So it's as if we're placing a bet, and we're placing a bet on the implications of the speculative view, the speculative monism, and one might think, given these two objections, that that's a very unreasonable bet.
And we're going to spend more time on the developed critiques of Schopenhauer's view. Connected
And
to
its
those
moral
two.
agenda.
In
Yeah.
moral agenda,
Yeah.
absolutely. I want to come back to this notion of temperament, because for Schopenhauer, he thinks philosophy must connect with our lived experience as whole human beings as opposed to simply rational creatures. He's credited with being the philosopher who dethrones the primacy of human beings as rational beings. Will is primary, which is non-rational, trans-rational, even irrational. So the notion of nous or logos or rationality as the benchmark of who we are as members of the species radically called into question, and that's a fissure in the history of philosophy. He's not the first, but he's the first to lay bare a whole system that is informed by that notion. And then the will to live, just as Nietzsche is going to talk about the will to power. And Nietzsche, of course, is a rich footnote to Schopenhauer. I like to say that to be provocative. But you read Nietzsche's and Schopenhauer as educators, the greatest tribute of a pupil to a teacher ever written in the modern world. You got to go back to Plato's tribute to Socrates to see that kind of embrace of a teacher. And I hope that's an essay that each and every one of you get a chance to read. But this notion of temperament is very important because there is a connection. We don't want to be reductionist, but there is a connection between the metaphysical and the autobiographical. That Arthur Schopenhauer, his father was very, very dry, distant, detached, and tended to send Arthur off with no real qualitative relation with him. His mother was a major writer of the day, a friend of Goethe, moved to Weimar, spent time with Goethe's circle of Schiller and company, and she would say to him very much what the mother of a living genius, namely the great Stephen Sondheim, had when his mother went to the hospital and was told, you have a chance of 50% of living. Is there anything you want to write? She says, give me a pen and paper. I'll write one sentence. And she wrote this to her son. I have no regrets of living other than giving birth to you. That's what the great Sondheim has been wrestling with. That's in Company. That's in Sweeney Todd. That's in Sunday in the Park with George. That's in all the geniuses that flow, works of genius that flowed from that kind of grimness and bleakness. You see, that kind of lovelessness and rejection that Johanna Schopenhauer, who had bestsellers of her day, even Schubert used her lyrics for music. The kind of visibility she had as a woman in a patriarchal context, but still, along with her husband, author in the world by himself with his text, with his books, trying to make sense of the world. And of course, nihilism is not just meaninglessness, it's also lovelessness and touchlessness and other forms of coldness and callousness in the world. So how then will he philosophically make sense of his own lived experience in light of his immense learning in relation to Plato, who makes the fundamental distinction at the very beginning of the Western philosophical tradition between becoming and being outside of time, becoming in time, becoming full of the variable, the changeable, the contingent, trying to gain access to the eternal. Distinction between reality and appearance. Appearance itself ephemeral, changeable. Reality, that form of being that Brother Unger just laid bare, outside of time. And then Kant with his distinction of phenomenal and noumenal that I think we've talked about already a bit in this class. I'm sure most of you already know about Kant's notion of the ways in which the conceptual schemes that we carry inside of us constitute an objective world, but not a real world. And the real world is a noumenal world, the Ding an sich, the thing in itself that we can never know, the unknowable. And when you bring together Plato and Kant, and he talks over and over again about what? He said, if you haven't read Kant, you're still blind, and when you read him, it's like having a cataract operation. All of a sudden, you begin to see, almost like the prefaces of Joseph Conrad, who was obsessed with Schopenhauer. I'm going to teach you how to see. That's the aesthetic of the Schopenhauer view that Conrad picks up on and the others, you see. And in teaching us how to see, what is he going to see? He sees massive misery. He sees ubiquitous suffering, and there's no way out through time. There's no way out through history. So he's going to engage in a rejection of temporality and historicity as sites of the kind of transformations that can make us better persons. And this is flying in the face of Hebrew scripture.
And a rejection not just of the historical world, the politics of society, but a rejection of nature itself. So, for example, take his attitude to sex. So the idea is the world has this great rush, this force. He is an evolutionary thinker before Darwin.
That's right.
And when life emerges, nature uses us for the purpose of reproduction and then casts us aside.
Casts us aside.
And what is necessary to the species is fatal to the individual. Nature decrees our annihilation. And the general attitude in philosophy and in the religions has been one of reverence for nature. And Schopenhauer's fundamental attitude is this is the enemy. I will not revere my enemy. And I will develop a view that doesn't adorn, that doesn't sentimentalize this brutal reality. So it's a remarkable example of philosophical courage and of the development of a view to its last consequences
Absolutely.
by a man who had no tendency to collaborationism with the invader being nature. And so this is a remarkable challenge to all of us.
I mean, this is part of his greatness, even when he's so wrong.
Yes.
But this rejection of the natural, but also of the historical. You see, this is what I mean, because we talked about individuality and historicity a couple of weeks ago, you see, of the historical. If the historical cannot be a site of any form of redemption, even amelioration,
Yes.
you see, transformation of any high quality, then where does one go? What does one do?
And how could it be if time itself is unreal in
Right.
Schopenhauer's view?
Right.
So
Rejection
again,
temporality.
this remark of this Augustinian idea that all ages are equidistant from eternity. So the only thing that counts is biography, not history. It's our experience, which is fundamentally the same. History is a nightmare from which we will awake through this philosophical enlightenment.
And remember what the epigraph is to the world as will and representation. Anybody remember where it comes from? It comes from Rousseau. What does it say? Quit thy childhood, my friend. Wake up. And the wake up is waking up from the nightmare of nature, history, individuality, the form of individualization of the will to live in your distinctive form of being human.
Yes.
So it's a radical challenge.
So, for example, one of the possibilities that is excluded, both implicitly and explicitly, is that the nature of sexual experience might be transfigured by love. And the image that is presented to us of reconciliation is of an altruism that is sexless, that is bodiless, that has no relation with our natural constitution. And this is the view of our fundamental possibilities. Now that then takes us to the next stage of our conversation,
Sure.
which is the moral project that emerges from this view. And it is a moral project, the hallmarks of which are serenity and benevolence. So the idea is that we awaken from these illusions about the world. We understand that all the distinctions and changes are illusory. And we develop a series of practices informed by this philosophical enlightenment that allow us to master the will, our cravings. And then we have a double reward. One side of the reward is serenity, self-possession, beyond craving. So what is our fundamental experience? Our experience is wanting the unlimited from the limited, and in particular wanting the unlimited from one another, this desperate longing. And we have to overcome this longing to enter into the possession of ourselves. The philosophical enlightenment is the basis, but the philosophical enlightenment is not enough. It has to be informed by a series of practices. And these practices allow us then to establish our relation to one another on a completely different basis. So what is the road to salvation in this view? It has several components converging in the same direction. So first, asceticism. We develop a series of ascetic practices by which we master the will. And asceticism, of course, is always paradoxical because it's as if we suffered in order to overcome suffering. We suffer deliberately, and in this way, master the cravings. Second, we develop compassionate action, altruism. And here, the contrast between altruism and love is crucial. There's no idea of love. This is altruism, with all the characteristics that distinguish altruism from love. It is given from a distance, from on high. It requires sacrifice, but no inner jeopardy or vulnerability. And there's no epistemological threshold. There's no problem of imagining the other, the otherness of the other. There's a problem of mastering our self-centeredness. And there's no reconciliation between the moral impulse and our natural constitution as expressed in sexual desire. The third element is the development of a detached view of the world, a disinterested view of the world, which is untainted by the will, by craving, and which Schopenhauer sees as most completely expressed in art, and especially among the arts in music. And he claims that at certain moments in our lives, we are more readily able to have this detached view of the world. So, for example, he says, this is the reason why children are so happy, demonstrating that he had little contact with children. They're disinterested. They're disinterested, they're willless, and are able to have this objective, contemplative approach to reality. And then there's the fourth road, beyond asceticism, compassionate and sacrificial action, and detached insight through art, which is the mystical intuition of the world. Which in a way he represents as if it were a prophecy of his own philosophy. His philosophy gives systematic expression to the view of reality that the mystics already foreshadowed. So there is a distinct approach to the conduct of life that emerges from this view. And on most of the conventional interpretations of Buddhism or of the religion of the Vedas, it would also be the view that was anticipated in that tradition. So it remains one of the great options for humanity.
Including the Christian mystics.
Including the mystics.
Meister Eckhart is one of the heroes. The last line of the text itself is a reference to the fifth sermon of Meister Eckhart, Madame de Guyon, and a whole host of mystics in the Christian tradition, similarly so with the Kabbalah. And he's very, very conversant with the Kabbalah and the rich Jewish mystical tradition and so forth. But all of these, in his view, we have to contest and see whether he's got them right, as a way of coping and enduring a view where the primacy of the will and overwhelming suffering and misery could lead toward paralysis. But he still, in some sense, wants to say yes. He's still a yay-sayer. He's not a naysayer. But his yes is in the form of being a spectator, of being involved in contemplation about the spectacle of the grimness and the bleakness. And that's why the artist, and especially the musician for him, and in his own life, he went to the opera and theater every night. Every night. He didn't miss it. It's like Kant making his walk in Königsberg every day. Schopenhauer had a picture of Kant on his wall, just like he had a picture of Buddha on his wall. But you see in the text, he wants to argue that in fact, his version of Christianity is one of thoroughgoing self-renunciation tied to the mystics. Now, it's very important to take a look at the preface for just a second, just to see what is informing his methodology, his orientation, his way into the text. He begins the text by saying, I want to teach you how to read my book. You remember that? And what's the first thing he says? He says, you'll never understand this book if you don't understand the introduction. And the introduction is in my dissertation, written 5 years ago when I was 23. The fourfold root of the principle of sufficient reason. Then he goes on to say, and you're never going to understand this book unless you read the appendix, the criticism of Kant's philosophy. So you say, oh, wow, this is going to be an interesting hermeneutical operation. In order to really get at this thing, we're going to have to do a whole lot of preparatory work. And he says, but I hate to quote myself, so you're going to read it on your own. Then he goes on to say, I have, like my master Kant, a will towards system. A will towards system. A will towards system, let's just put it that way. It's got to have an architectonic structure. It's not going to be aphoristic like Lichtenberg or Nietzsche or Pascal or the one figure who he did translate, a Spanish Jesuit mystic named Gracian, Gracian. He was from Spanish into German, the art of worldly wisdom. No, I am a philosopher. He's still a philosopher in the Kantian sense of having a system. And when Brother Roberto talks about the ways in which his understanding of how will relates to suffering in the world, will relates to feeling, will relates to our lived existence, maybe in fact this obsession with self-possession, of having and not having, and his will to system does not allow him to linger on the ways in which, like Goethe, nature might have sources of joy. To linger on those historical realities that can be sources of enabling a wiser, more compassionate, to use his language, existence. But it's either or. You have it or you don't. So he's got a negative conception of happiness, joy. It's the absence of this pain. So already, even in his methodological orientation, he's saying, you'll never understand what I'm doing unless you understand my sense of the whole, which is a sense of my corpus, which is a sense of an overriding vision of the world. Now, I think that's a good thing. This is what makes him who he is. But we have to be very suspicious of any will to system. This is a Kierkegaardian sensibility. This is a Pascalian sensibility. This is a late Wittgensteinian sensibility. The sense of it all hanging together so coherently that you downplay the specificity of certain kinds of feelings, sensibilities in nature and history that can help you endure, that can help you sustain yourself, including something called traditions. And of course, the irony here is there's no Schopenhauer without the Platonic and without the Kantian traditions. Author, where do you come from? Plato. Sounds like history to me. Sounds like genealogy to me. Where else do you come from, author? Kant. And anybody who hadn't read Kant will never understand what I'm talking about. Sounds like history to me. Every ahistorical gesture has a history. Every attempt to escape history has a history. And this would be one of the countervailing moves that one makes against such a towering figure who's trying to wrestle with this undeniable suffering that he is in tune with.
So the limitations of system are related to the error of trying to have a philosophical superscience.
That's right.
This is what
That's right.
Hume called the delirium.
That's right.
But so we need this ambition in philosophy in order to achieve distance from the conventional ideas, contrary to what Hume said. But then we have to be afraid that our system building will imprison us
Absolutely.
and prevent us from discovering the surprises of experience and of history,
That's right.
because every powerful project has to be self-subversive. And so it needs to be open to what it doesn't include. And that's why a contemporary of Schopenhauer's, the philosopher and writer Friedrich Schlegel, said, two things are fatal to the spirit. One is to have a system, and the other is not to have one. And this is the problem. This has to be part of our methodological ambition in our arguments.
And how do you walk that slippery
Yes.
tightrope? But one of the ways in which Schopenhauer also tries to escape time and history is his notion of genius. You remember the epigraph to the appendix where he talks about the privilege of true genius for those who create new passworks is to make great mistakes with impunity. So genius does have shortcomings built in, but genius is also a way of separating a chosen slice at the top who provides some glimpse of what the wheel, unmediated by concepts, look like, namely the artist, and especially the musicians. Now, he's got some nice references to Raphael. I was always disappointed he doesn't talk about Rembrandt, because Rembrandt's too historical. Rembrandt's too human. He's too humane. He's too rooted in time. All of those self-portraits over time changing, displaying the impact of time on his face and on his body and so forth and so on, you see. But at the same time, I mean, there is something to the notion of genius to the degree to which you can actually find the kind of unbelievable single-mindedness artistically expressed in the very everyday people that Schopenhauer has such deep suspicion.
So he says something else about genius, Cornell, which is very interesting for our arguments later on in the course. He contrasts in The World as Will and Representation the talented person and the genius.
Oh, yes.
And he says,
Yes.
a talented man is a marksman who hits a target that others cannot hit. A genius is a marksman who hits a target that others cannot see. And this is a fundamental insight into the nature of genius. Genius is not a form of facility. It's not like a super smartness. So it often happens among academics that they think when they're very clever that they're entitled to be geniuses, as if the genius would simply be the smartest one in the group. But that's not what genius is. And it's this quality of vision.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And that's related then to these issues that we were discussing about system and history. So it's necessary to gain distance, to transcend, to resist, to work against one's time, but at the same time, one has to be open to experience and to self-subversion. And we then think that this is not just a quality to develop in our lives individually, but collectively, a project for society. That prophetic powers can be widely diffused in the whole of humanity by the right kind of economic organization, by the right kind of politics, and by the right kind of education. And this is a great theme, to which I think Schopenhauer cannot do justice within the limits of his system because of its anti-empirical, anti-historical, anti-political character.
I mean, and there we're on the way to Emerson. But we should say this before we open it up, that the one and only Herman Melville was also obsessed with Schopenhauer. Deeply obsessed with Schopenhauer. And he even uses the language of the Ixion, the will of Ixion, at the very end of of Moby Dick, where Ishmael is out there on the raft, and the raft is what? It's a coffin, trying to get out of the desiring, the craving that was at work at Ahab's obsession with the whiteness of the well and the well itself. And so there you got a artist with democratic sensibilities. There is genius on the Pequot. And Pequot is the American nation state in some sense, you see. So it's like Emerson. He's got a democratic sensibility. Schopenhauer has none at all. Schopenhauer is reactionary to the core. When he dies, he writes as part of his will, I want to thank the soldiers who were trying to shoot at the folk in the 1848 revolution to protect my property. So, I mean, you know, he's my brother, but we don't have the same politics. Let me put it that way. Whereas Melville is like Emerson in terms of finding the genius of finding that mark that nobody can even see, let alone the talent of having the mark, finding that mark that people can't hit, but still has this Schopenhauerian sensibility of overwhelming suffering, domination,
serenity and benevolence, and then the view that he developed in an essay that the basis of this universalistic altruism is precisely our sameness. It's the opposite of the other view, that love is about difference and about reconciliation because of difference or despite difference. And that then brings us to the next to the last stage in this conversation, which is then the criticism of this moral agenda.
We've already given some of it.
Well, some of it, but of course the criticism is always delivered from the standpoint of another conception, another approach to existence. So there's no neutral position in this worldwide debate about approaches to the conduct of life. So what could one say? One could say at the beginning that there's a fundamental misunderstanding in this approach to the conduct of life about what is implied, what is required to come into the possession of life and to be free. What is required is engagement and connection. No one is free alone. No one is free without engagement in a particular world. And then we have to deal with those contradictions that we addressed in an earlier discussion. We need the others, but every connection with the others threatens us with subjugation and loss of distinction. How can we connect without losing ourselves? And this is both a project for society, for politics, and a project for the individual. And then to be free, we have to engage in a particular world, because no one can be free alone, isolated from engagement in a world, not just connected to the others. But if the price of such engagement is surrender to that world, we're not free. So somehow we have to be able to engage without surrendering and to be insiders and outsiders at the same time. So our emancipation on this view, our ascent to a higher form of life, our coming into the possession of life in real historical time, requires us to deal with these contradictions in our relation to the others and in our relation to the world. And we could add to them a third set of contradictions, which are contradictions in our relation to ourselves. We need to form a coherent personality, but the coherent personality can become a mummy, the rigidified form of the self, the character and its circumstance, and within this mummy we begin to die, many small deaths. So we have to be able to escape this mummy. And freedom means then confronting these three sets of contradictions so that we can live. So life in this view, in opposition to Schopenhauer, is not a state of negation of the privation of suffering. It's the ascent to more achieved by reckoning with these three sets of contradictions. Now, that relates to the comment that Cornell made in an earlier class about kenosis. So kenosis is the emptying out. And we could think of it as related to the virtues of simplicity, attentiveness, and enthusiasm. And we liberate ourselves from the peripheral so that we can address the central. But on this view, the view that I just summarized by the reference to these three sets of contradictions, kenosis is a threshold. It's the preliminary to something else. It's the preliminary to a higher life, achieved through struggle, through the reckoning with these contradictions. It's not the end state. It's not the goal in itself. And it seems that in Schopenhauer's moral agenda, kenosis is itself the end rather than the threshold. And that then brings us then to a summary statement of this fundamental objection to this moral agenda, that it's as if we were to deal with the terrible sufferings of life by retreating into a fortress, a citadel. And then we find that this fortress is empty, as if we could achieve liberation from suffering by emptying out the fortress and closing all the walls. And we're not like that. So in this solitary and empty fortress, we will not become serene. We will become anxious, bored, self-divided. We will not be rewarded with a serenity. We will not be able to achieve this connection with the others, because the connection with the others requires the imagination of difference and the penetration of difference by love or by free cooperation among free and equal individuals. So this is a view of life that promises a form of happiness that it cannot deliver. It's a promise that cannot be kept. And the promise is based on a misunderstanding of ourselves and of the world. That would be a summary description delivered from a hostile, opposing standpoint. And of course, to be fair, the problem at the end, which we described under the label of the category of the cognitive gap, is that we never know enough to make these choices conclusively, and yet we have to make them.
Let me just end with a defense of Schopenhauer, even though I think he's wrong, but that's all
We
right.
still haven't gotten to the last step of hope.
Oh, well, we can bring that in.
Yeah.
Because I think Schopenhauer would want to argue that no matter how athletic we are in our concern in time and history of change and transformation, what is waiting for us at the end is still a certain kind of asceticism. Even among those who engage in kenosis. That Amos, Esther, Jesus, Muhammad, Martin King, Ella Baker, they are oftentimes isolated and by themselves and on their way to crucifixion. Character crucifixion, literal crucifixion. There is a alienation and an isolation even among those who are fundamentally wedded to the transformative project that Brother Roberto's talking about. So he would want to argue, I mean, Eusebius used to talk about this, Brother Marcus made this point, where he talked about the monks as athletes of piety, athletes for piety. And what is athletics? Athletics is not some cheap form of entertainment. Leave that to market-driven America. Athletics is a form of artistry. Brother Kobe taught us that. Michael Jordan teaches it. Larry Bird teaches it. Same is true with musicians. Not cheap entertainment. It's a profound form of artistry, not just of the subject matter of the art, but of life itself. The art of living. And Schopenhauer does acknowledge that the artists and especially the musicians provide a spectator-like view of what it is to be athletes and ascetics. But he thinks only a spectator. Because the moment you become a participant, no matter how long you are involved in that struggle of transformation, you're still on your way to being isolated and alienated. You see? And that's a serious, I think that's a serious challenge. I think he's got some important points to make. We don't have to necessarily accept all his conclusions.
But the fundamental picture is that on the groundless, unable
Right.
to discern
That's right. The
the
unknown.
meaning
for-
of existence, the
Right.
framework of our existence, we're on the way to death, to our annihilation. Terrified of death, and then in the meantime tortured by insatiability. But it's as if the agenda, the response were to say, we'll deal with death by dying beforehand. So it's as if the experience of life will give up as an antidote to mortality, and will in this way be freed from insatiability. Isn't that what it is in the end? Because what is life but complication? And so that's this question of whether kenosis is just the threshold or kenosis is the goal itself.
But he would come back and say, though, that the artists and the musicians, let's say the artists and the saints, to use a word of a certain association with these athletes of piety, that they provide an image of how we do cope, and they unleash to us ways of conceiving the world, perceiving the world, that enable us not to completely succumb.
But then one would say he misrepresents the significance of art, because consider the nature of the imagination. Because the same problem of whether kenosis is the goal or the threshold, whether it is the absence of struggle or whether it is struggle, appears in the workings of the mind. So what are the defining moves of the imagination? You could say the art is about imagination.
Absolutely.
In a sense. So one is the one that Kant emphasizes, distancing from the phenomena. To imagine, we have to step away from the immediate experience. So the image is the memory of a perception. So that's the beginning of this distancing. But that's only the first move of the imagination. The second defining move of the imagination is insight into transformative variation. We understand something by subsuming it under a range of adjacent possibles and imagining what it could become given certain provocations or external events. Not the ultimate possible, but the next steps that it could turn into. That's the second part of the imagination. So the brute facticity of the world, that it is what it is and not something else, is to some extent dissolved through the work of the imagination, because we see that the actual is a variant of a set of possibles. And this is then the work of the imagination, which art continues, deepening our insight into reality by expanding our imagination of the possible. But all of that is transformation. It's not a state of emptiness or of stasis. It's this work which goes on in existence and then in the mind, and which is our liberation to the extent that we can aspire to liberation.
I think Arthur would say that discloses a certain modern romantic prejudice in terms of how you conceive of imagination. Thomas Mann, in his great essay on Schopenhauer, talks about Schopenhauer's creative objectivity. So that the first moment of imagination he accepts, the second moment he doesn't accept. And the reason why he doesn't accept it is because all the talk and engagement of transformation is still on its way to new forms and sites of suffering and misery.
Yes.
There's no way you ever eliminate that. And therefore, he falls back on his contemplative, spectator-like
Yeah.
orientation.
And Cornell, that brings us to the last
Yeah,
step
and then we're gonna
in
open
this
it up.
plan
Ooh,
of our conversation,
Yeah, okay.
which is how much we're entitled to hope for.
Mm-hmm.
And this issue of hope brings us up to the point of departure of nihilism.
Yes,
So
yeah.
you can imagine a ladder. This came up earlier in earlier classes. The least hopeful is this view that happiness is the negation of suffering. It's a state of privation. And thus serenity defined as this condition of inactivity, of contemplative relation to the world, rather than transformative and active relation to the world, which is how he represents art. Then you could take a second ladder, a second rung in the ladder, in which you could say, no, we can hope for more than that. We can hope for a form of happiness that is fullness of activity. We expand on many different fronts. It's not emptiness, it's more content, more fronts to existence, more experience, more light, more life. And then it is perpetuated, achieved, and maintained by some kind of moderation or equilibrium. This is the dominant form of ethics of Aristotle in the Hellenistic period and throughout many of the world traditions of philosophy when speculative monism did not prevail. And so that would be a higher hope. Now, you can go one step further. And this is the step that you might describe as romantic or Christian. And we can say happiness is indeed fullness of activity, but it has no stopping point. And it is not achieved or perpetuated by moderation as a kind of balance. On the contrary, it requires imbalance and contradiction and conflict, making possible transformation. Transformation of society, self-transformation, so we can come into the possession of life only by not stopping, not by stopping. And it's not serenity that we need, it's vulnerability. And this is a completely different idea. And this is an idea which would have seemed paradoxical in most of the philosophical traditions of humanity, and yet has immense power to us in this revolutionary period in the history of the world, the moral revolution. And I think that this is a higher hope, higher than that second rung in the ladder, and much higher than the first rung. And now there's a philosophical difficulty. What entitles us to these hopes other than an idea about ourselves and then experience? And so we come back to this issue of the cognitive gap. That so hope is not just an ironic or contemplative attitude to the world. It's an anticipation of what is possible that has to be linked to transformative action. So hope is not optimism. Optimism is a contemplative and ironic attitude. And the difference between hope and optimism is made clear by a joke about the philosopher Leibniz. Now, you know, Leibniz is associated with the doctrine that this is the best of all possible worlds. And there's a very old joke that was formulated by a contemporary of Leibniz, which is the following. What is the difference between an optimist and a pessimist? And the optimist is the one who says, this is the best of all possible worlds. And the pessimist is the one who responds, you're right. And what this reveals is that, there's, in a sense, philosophically, optimism and pessimism are the same, because they just give a different price, a different value to the same untransformed reality. Hope is about transformation, and transformation related to action, intellectual or spiritual action, as well as practical action. And so then, on this note, I propose that we open the conversation, but the implicit thesis is that to the extent that there is an answer to nihilism, the answer to nihilism is hope.
Of a certain sort.
And hope is not simply a hypothesis
Of a
about what
certain
the
sort.
world is, but is a stake in the transformation of the world and of our experience.
Just 2 minutes. Schopenhauer is pagan. So his conception of hope is much closer to that of Thucydides in the Million Dialogue, where the argument is hope is dangerous. That's why it's in Pandora's box. And what's dangerous about hope is that it renders you naked and can generate self-destruction if it's illusions that you are following that can allow you to move in even more jeopardy-like conditions. So it's hope of a certain sort, and he's much closer to Thucydides than he is to prophetic legacy of Jerusalem, where hope is both virtue and verb. It's a form of action and movement, but it's informed by a vision that allows you, that lures you to engage in this kind of transformation and have certain kinds of wise expectations, not any expectation, because Thucydides is still inescapable. You have to have a wise judgment in regard to the kind of hope that you are tied to. But let's open it up. You all been, yes.
Thank y'all so much. Just to continue on the topic of hope, I think in this conversation today, y'all talked about whether it's human beings in relationship to
Louder,
art.
please.
We talked about human beings in relationship to art. We talked about hope. I want to know, where does love fit in this conversation? And how does love engage with hope?
But for Schopenhauer's love of truth, it just happens that truth is pretty icy in terms of its effects and consequences. So we don't want to push him off the love train now. Everybody on the love train don't have the same kind of love. But his love of truth, you remember how he ends the preface of 1818, right? Truth will win out. In the long run, my work, even though I've been overlooked, it will win out because I'm laying bare the truth. That's a profound love of truth that he gets from the Greeks, mediated with Judaism and Christianity, but he tries to understand a conception of truth that's very different than what you get in Judaism and Christianity and Islam, and he thinks it's much closer to Buddhism. So that love is crucial, and I think Brother Roberto, Professor Unger laid bare, a difference between love and altruism, the connection between love and solidarity, our need for connection, our need for attachment, and so forth. I think that...
But the specific question, as I understood it, is the relation between love and hope. So, and I would say love is hope about one of the fundamental contradictions in our existence, which is that we can't be connected to the other without losing ourselves. So the love embodies the hope of resolving that contradiction. And then the problem is it doesn't flourish outside the domain of intimacy, so we need an equivalent to it in life among strangers, which can't just be this distant and officious altruism, but something else, like a particular form of cooperation. That's the relation between love and hope. That love, on this other view, is one of the main expressions of hope about one of the fundamental obstacles to coming into the possession of life.
But when Kafka says there's hope for God, there's no hope for us, You know, Franz, what do you have in mind? What is your relation to Schopenhauer? We also read closely. And again, it's a question of a particular understanding, interpretation of hope.
Yes.
Because hope's not one thing. It's subject to, it's polysemic, it's polymorphous. So what kinds of views of hope do we have in mind that could generate the kind
Yes.
of talk that Brother
Yes.
Burroughs put forth?
So think of it another way, just to develop the argument about the relation between love and hope. And this has political implications as well as moral implications. So, what do we want from one another? We want everything, the unlimited, recognition of all forms. And it's as if we want a transaction that can never be completed. There's never enough. And that's a very different conception from altruism. So the problem of love, the difficulty of love, is that it is, as it were, infected by the longing for the infinite. Now, then think of it in this context of the love of a parent for the child. So the parent says to the child, I love you unconditionally. And in my love, you have an unconditional place in the world. That's what we all want, an unconditional place in the world. And now go out and raise a storm in the world because you're assured in this haven. And that's, as it were, a model for what we would want politically, a different way of thinking about fundamental rights, immunities and safeguards. We say the individual should have a haven of vital protected interest, immunities, and capability assuring endowments. But we give him this haven so that everything else in society can be thrown open to a storm of experiment and change. He should be capable and unafraid, like the seraph Abdiel in Paradise Lost, unseduced, unshaken, unterrified. And what do we have in the conventional liberal discourse of fundamental rights is the part about the haven. But where's the part about the storm? So one is just the reverse side of the other. The storm has to be organized. So it means democratizing the market economy. It means creating a high energy democracy. It means changing radically the form of education. That's the collective form of it. And it shows you again how there are these intimate links between love and hope.
Question, go jump right into it.
So, the point that you were making earlier, describing on a high level Schopenhauer's metaphysics, when it says suffering is pervasive, everything is ephemeral, mutable, and the experience of the mind is fundamental. That is one of the many things that reminds me of Buddhism and Indian philosophy of Schopenhauer. I know that he was familiar with that on a kind of surface level and was very interested in it. But I'm wondering how much, now that we have such a broader and deeper understanding of Buddhism and Indian philosophy, does that resolve any of the problems of Schopenhauer by looking at it from a different angle that has thousands of years sort of the same problems today?
But I'm not sure I understand the question. The question.
Schopenhauer's not the first person to say that suffering is fundamental.
Yes, that this was a position that was powerfully represented in ancient Indian philosophy and in Buddhism. So it's not just the philosophy of a European philosopher. It is one of the permanent options in the philosophical and spiritual history of humanity. And then it becomes more interesting if we explore it in different forms that is taken in world history. But the question is whether then its ancient Indian form would add aspects to the picture that we can't get simply from Schopenhauer. And we don't have the answer to that question. but the intuition is that yes, it would, and that and that it was also the case for the representation of this idea in the medieval mysticism, in the mystical countercurrents in the Semitic monotheisms.
One of the wonderful things about Schopenhauer's text is that just reading it is in and of itself a paideia, an education. The variety of voices on page after page after page, from all of these different figures, the West, the East, and so forth, that echo in some sense or are consistent and constant with what he's talking about. So when he invokes Sophocles, Euripides, Plutarch, all of these folk talking about suffering, they have different responses to it. You know, Sophocles talking about phronesis. The only thing we have is the ability to bend, like Antigone. How do you bend? She's not going to bend. She's in trouble. Creon's not going to bend either. He's in trouble. What happened to phronesis? But massive suffering at work. Oedipus, we go on, you see. And on the other way, Freud's on the other side. Schopenhauer, we know Freud alludes to Schopenhauer 17 times in his works, but still denies the influence. Okay, Sigmund, sure, all right. But it's very continuous in terms of massive suffering, misery, and so forth. And so then the question becomes, in the ancient Indian traditions, does he add something that they don't have? Why is he reading Upanishad every night before he goes to bed? That talks about the deepest insights, recognizes the greater which we're never able to overcome this suffering. Therefore, we ought to call into question the very craving itself, the kind of dialogue we had last week with our dear brother here, you see. Which is not an answer to your question again, but it's a way of kind of framing it so that we see what we think is distinctive. Schopenhauer is betwixt and between. He comes out of this Western philosophical tradition with his heroes and recognizes, lo and behold, this major overlap with Buddhism, you see, and Jewish and Christian mystics who are concerned about union with something that is outside of time. Because the Gnostics had already told us the creation itself is catastrophe.
Yes.
And there's no way out. That's ancient. That's profound. That's provocative. Is it persuasive? Interesting question. You see what I mean?
But just to make clear, in here to be entirely candid about one of the sources of misunderstanding. So Parimal Patel,
our brother last week,
week, presented Buddhism and ancient Indian philosophy in a way which was surprising to many of us, because the standard conception of Buddhism and ancient Indian philosophy is that it relates an approach to the conduct of life to a conception of ultimate reality, the speculative monism, or some variant of it, as Schopenhauer does. So in the construction here of the sequence in the course, the idea is that before we dealt with the two main secular ethics that are in contest today, and that we call here the ethic of self-construction and the ethic of connection, we would deal with two major views in the world history of philosophy and religion that relate how we should deal with others to how we should deal with the ultimate source of reality and value in the world. And one is Christianity, or more broadly, the religions of the Bible, the Semitic monotheisms. And the other is the speculative monism, as exemplified by Buddhism and by Schopenhauer. But Patel came and said, no, don't think of it that way. Don't take seriously this representation of the world. You should interpret it as being a series of proposals about how to live or how to relate, with no such metaphysical presuppositions. It doesn't have the metaphysical presuppositions. So then, on that view, on that interpretation, it wouldn't be in this category it would be together with the secular ethics that we're going to address later. So that's a different dispute about what's the correct interpretation of ancient Indian philosophy or of Buddhism. But the fundamental principle remains this choice, this methodological choice. Do we make the program for the conduct of life depend on some general view of the world and of our situation in the world or not? And regardless of our position in that debate about the right way you interpret ancient Indian philosophy, we still have that choice to make. And we're in these two classes, or these three classes now, about Christianity, Buddhism, and Schopenhauer, we are in a way exploring the consequences of the decision to make the conduct of life depend on these metaphysical presuppositions or this larger theological context. And what's interesting is that it's not as if there were 1,000 different positions. The debate that has emerged in the history of humanity has a very particular shape. And one of our ambitions here is to reveal that shape. There are a very small number of major options. And the ideas have coalesced around those options. And each of them has an internal logic, which we're exploring in these conversations.
So, can you describe the nature of the imagination? You mentioned this distance from the immediate experience.
Yes.
I can see how that's true, let's say, for the imagination of the artist as spectator of life, but it also got me thinking, let's say, of the imagination of the child as protagonist of life. I don't know necessarily that for the child, imagination creates kind of this separation from experience as much as it is a part of the experience. And then the reason why I'm, let's say, troubled by this is because when you describe hope, you say it's the anticipation of what is possible. And it seems to me that what is possible is so largely shaped by imagination. So,
But what's at stake is ultimately a conception of who we are. And so in this case, it's a debate about the nature of the mind. So my remarks about the imagination presuppose a view of the mind. And here's then an abbreviated statement of that view of the mind. So it says, the mind has two sides. In one side, the mind is like a machine. It's formulaic and it's modular. It has functions and parts. The functions are related to the parts. In another aspect, the mind is an anti-machine. So it's not modular, it's not formulaic. It has the capacity that in mathematics we call recursive infinity, of combining everything with everything else. And above all, it has the ability to defy and transgress its own settled methods and presuppositions. It's what the poet called negative capability. So you discover something, what Schopenhauer calls vision, and after the fact, you make sense of it. So the side of the mind that is not modular, that is not formulaic, that has the power of recursive infinity and the faculty of negative capability is what we call the imagination. And what is the imagination? The imagination is the attribute of transcendence in our mental experience. And then we can ask, what defines the relative power of the two sides of the mind? Nothing in the physical constitution of the brain. The relative power of these two sides of the mind is defined by the organization of society and of culture, of the economy, of politics, and of education. So in that sense, the history of politics is internal to the history of the mind. And then, now this is related to a political goal we have. So in 1968, when I was very young, I saw on the walls the following words, which appeared mysteriously all over the world as if they had been written by an angel. And the words were, imagination in power. And then everyone grew up and put aside those words as meaningless dreams. but your friend here took them to heart and has tried to figure out what they mean. And because the poet Blake says, if the fool would persist in his folly, he would become wise. And so so then we can ask, this is we who need structural alternatives and don't want to succumb to a structural dogmatism, what does it mean for the imagination to be empowered? So in the economy, it means that the form of production that is closest to the imagination, today the knowledge economy, be radicalized and disseminated, and not confined to a series of exclusive fringes. In politics, it means that we organize a form of high energy democracy that is the perpetual creation of the new, not just the rule of the majority qualified by the rights of minorities. And so raising the temperature of politics, accelerating the pace, combining strong central initiative with radical devolution. And in education, it means that we organize education as a systematic attack on the orthodoxies of the university culture. And we teach every subject from contrasting points of view. Then the imagination is empowered. And if the imagination is empowered, we're organizing society to put at the center our crucial attribute of transcendence. Now, going back to Schopenhauer, it seems to me that's a very high bar of hope. And the question is whether we're entitled to that hope or not. And I would say that as a critic, as an opponent of Schopenhauer's view, that Schopenhauer presents us a view of the world from which such high hopes are banished as illusions. And we settle for something else. But now we have to decide because there's a great deal going for Schopenhauer's view by way of experience. And this hope seems to be, can be accused of being a mirage. So this is a way of evoking the connection of the moral disputes with the political disputes.
But if you look at it from another point of view, someone who Schopenhauer evokes over and over again in his text, Leopardi, who's even more grim than Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer is too upbeat for Giacomo because he's got his own illusions. What's the first footnote in the text in the preface? Comes from Pliny. You all remember that moment? What does Pliny say? Maybe we should just read it. You got it right there. Pliny says, that which is impossible is viewed to be impossible until it's done. I'm going to do it. Read my text. Now, Leopardi would say from the very beginning, very much like Ecclesiastes, please get off your high horse, Arthur. It's going to be another incoherent, fallible, failed, but interesting, creative, and profound effort. But you're not going to solve that enigma. All of that ambition that you have at 26 years old is not going to provide the definitive interpretation of the world and what it means to be human, you see. And so therefore, the ambitions of Schopenhauer himself, because when you're talking about hope, especially in our own lives, you have to come to terms with what are the sources of the very self-confidence to even put forward your definition of reality. Where did that come from? You have to tell a story about that. That's also what piety is about. What are the ways in which you have been empowered and enabled that you end up so grim and bleak with your erudition? So that's what it means to be historicized all the way down, even as you're trying to escape historicity. Now, when you look at it that way, you say, good God, this negative capability that Brother Roberto's talking about, that's Keats, right? Being in the midst of doubts and insecurities without any irritable reaching after fact or reason. So all you have is imagination as a source of endurance. Keats says the fundamental question of life is energy or Despair. How much energy can you generate? How much ruah do you really have? What kinds of spirits and energies are sustaining you? That's Keatsian, because that's tragic now. It is partly romantic, but it's not romantic in any textbook way. It is profoundly tragic, because Keats knows there's going to be fallibility and failure built into his own achievement. That try again, fail better, that Beckett's going to talk about. And you're going to fail better, John. We appreciate that. Dead at 25. The effort magnificent, but still full of blindnesses, shortcomings, and so forth, you see. So we don't want to cast Schopenhauer somehow as if he is so grim and so bleak that he doesn't have folk who view him as tied into certain kind of illusions. So he begins to look a little bit too quasi-romantic. What's all this imagination that we're talking about here? What's waiting for the imaginative projects of transformation and so forth? This was one of the debates that took place between William James and Josiah Royce. You read Josiah Royce's History of Philosophy of 1892, The Spirit of Modern Philosophy. His chapter on Schopenhauer was longer than his chapter on Kant, because he was obsessed with Schopenhauer as an American philosopher. That's about as un-American as you can get, to be obsessed with Schopenhauer. But he's over against James's strenuous mood. He's over against James's talk about change, transformation, and so forth. And there's a fascinating overlap between Brother Roberto and William James in that sense, even though Roberto's got a much more robust conception of structures and institutions than William James has. But William James is still wedded to this engagement of conflict and transformation, generating alternative possibilities in which hope is tied to a futurity that can be better than the present. Question, yes?
So you mentioned the story when the last person was writing, when he died, I just
Louder, loud.
maybe we feel like he was grateful for the soldiers fighting for the land, the property.
Oh, yes, and with the police.
Yeah, and it really makes me think like as someone who's really like self-philosophical like he is, I think so selfishly as my interpretation. At the same time, he got a lot of influence from Eastern philosophy, talking about compassion is basic morality. And so how is that combined? How is him like this or him talking about compassion kind of blend together in one person, and how he makes sense of the world in that way?
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful question. But he had a selective compassion when it came to people who suffer. He was one of the few 19th century, early 19th century German philosophers who had a massive indictment of the institution of slavery in the United States. He had deep solidarity with black people in their enslavement. Not that he thought they were equal to white. In their enslavement. And he comes to that over and over and over again. And he's got an unbelievable sensitivity, like our dear brother Peter Singer and a few others, with not just animals, but dogs. He said, I can't live without music and dogs. And he had two favorite dogs. And when he got home, he finally got unconditional love. You know how dogs get all excited, see you and say, I don't care what you did. I don't know what kind of day you had, but I'm just so glad you're here. Not because you're just bringing me food, but I really do like you. I really do love you. And he talks about his two dogs. That's all he had other than Rossini and Beethoven and those operas that he went through every night, and very, very few friends in terms of his lived experience. So if you looked at it from the vantage point of how he connected to the enslaved, highly compassionate. How he related to those folk in the street organizing, trying to engage in social transformation, he's on the side of the hierarchy of the status quo in using repressive apparatus to keep them contained and controlled. Yes? Oh, you want to run it?
To what Professor Unger was saying earlier,
Well, I think he's got to
I can come back.
go pay his dues in nature. Yeah.
It was more about this idea of what is the correct or right way to interpret Indian philosophy. And I think going back to what Professor Patel said last week, is what he was really trying to say is that very idea of correctness or rightness in content is where the binary of East and West really starts, versus he was really talking about the correctness and rightness in context, right? So how do you treat your neighbor versus do you know a scripture? the idea of interpreting anything correctly is very contradictory to the nature of that philosophy in the first place. In fact, even when someone bringing it up, it's really the context and the matter and the very single, very specific instance in which it exists of how we conduct our lives. Not how we view the world, not how we view life, but the way in which we choose to live.
No, I think you're right. I think what we saw last week was marvelous. I thought he was magnificent in a number of different ways, but he was trying to say that the larger metaphysical picture that seems to inform our practical judgments actually is a difference that doesn't make a difference. What Wittgenstein would say, will that terms that doesn't affect the mechanism. And so the texts on metaphysics have very little to say about the practical judgment, what we call practical wisdom, our capacity to engage in context-dependent judgments as to how we engage, how we intervene, how we live, how we conduct ourselves, you see. And see, for Roberto's looking for the larger connection between the metaphysical and the practical wisdom being exercised. And our brother was saying, well, no, it's very loose. It's so separate that it's not really going to be one that is as useful as one would think. And that's a wonderful conversation about what is the relation between the metaphysical and the moral. Yes.
As Hope gives CPR or new life to the will, which Schopenhauer would say is the source of materialism and self-interest.
The transformation of the will toward.
So does Hope that the will to then pursue your own individual needs rather than the interests of the collective over yourself?
At a certain level, at a certain register, it certainly does. That's why he's still opting for benevolence. That's why he's still opting for identifying with the suffering of others, given one's own suffering, or at least the blurring of the distinction between a self and other selves, because that's how he characterizes it in the text, you see. But in the end, that's still going to be profoundly dissatisfying too. That's going to be unfulfilling too for him. In the end, you're going to have to call that craving into question. You're going to have to call the will into question and somehow escape through contemplative art or escape through certain kind of ascetic exercises.
Maybe picking up on that point a little bit.
Yes.
I struggle to understand, struggling to connect here, the idea of denial of the will to live and this theme that you articulate often of dying before death. And I couldn't quite understand what Schopenhauer was saying was the method, right?
Or the way in which we go about denying this fundamental will to live. Did you want to read a passage out loud? Just read that before we go.
He says this is on page 383. Intuitively, or in concreto, every man is really conscious of all philosophical truths. But to bring them into his abstract knowledge, into reflection, is the business of the philosopher, who neither ought to nor can do more than this. Thus it may be that the inner nature of holiness, of self-renunciation, mortification, asceticism, etc., is here for the first time expressed in abstract terms, free from everything mythical, as denial of the will to live. And so that seems to be saying you deny your own self, your own ability to express, because you don't know where all those things are going to go anyways, in the hope that somehow the forces which are being exerted from the social world are going to replace that would be, in a certain sense, better, but I couldn't, it doesn't make sense to me. I don't see what he's opting for here with this self-denial.
Remember the references, though, to Luther in the text, where he's talking about works are inadequate. There has to be a form of self-denial that connects you to something bigger than you. Something like grace, let's say. So that self-denial and self-renunciation is, in fact, an attempt to wrestle with the roots of the craving and the education of that will in such a way that is tied to the will of something bigger than you, that you surrender to. Just like falling in love. There's a force that hits you so strong that you begin to understand yourself in relation to a will different than yours, that orients your soul and life in a different kind of way. Now there he's just trying to say, look at the resonances of what I'm talking about that seem to be so radical. That's actually already at work in certain conceptions of self-denial and self-renunciation within a tradition that most people of his day know something about. But he's on his way to the mystics. He said the move from Luther to Meister Eckhart was a hell of a jump. Because Eckhart is talking about union with God and almost becoming God-like. With radical, massive self-denial linked to certain kind of spiritual exercises, you see. So I think that he's trying to get us to see that his view is not as alien as one would think, but it is, in fact, over against so much of what many of us have been socialized to believe about the primacy of the moral and spiritual as it connects to individuality and history and our own.
But the simple answer to your question is he's denying the epiphenomenal self, the self that craves, the self that's embodied in this ephemeral body, and he is affirming the universal soul, which he believes to be the real reality. And so then our connection with the others is that we're all the same. There's no struggle of love. There's the passive recognition of our oneness that we achieve after dissociating ourselves from all the stuff of our existence, of its apparent transformations and distinctions. This is the radical consequence of his
But
view.
in Eckhart, though, there's still a love.
No, of course,
Of love of
because he's
God.
still a Christian.
Right. He's still got a Christian, got a toehold in the
And
Christian.
Schopenhauer's not a Christian.
Right, that's right.
And
That's right.